August 12th, 1944. 0200 hours, 180 miles northeast of Luzon. Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa stood motionless on the bridge of his flagship, the carrier Zuikaku, watching American aircraft circle his task force in complete darkness. Through his binoculars, he could see the distinctive silhouettes of Grumman Hellcats and Avengers, maintaining perfect formation despite the moonless night. No flares illuminated their path. No searchlights guided their approach. Yet these enemy pilots maneuvered with precision that defied everything the Imperial Japanese Navy understood about night aviation operations. The mathematics of impossibility were unfolding before Ozawa's eyes. For 3 decades, Japanese naval doctrine had proclaimed night operations the exclusive domain of the Imperial fleet. Their pilots had trained in darkness since the 1920s. Their surface vessels had dominated every major night engagement since Pearl Harbor. The concept of sustained carrier-based night strikes, operating with clockwork precision, seemed to violate the fundamental laws of naval warfare. What Ozawa witnessed that August morning would shatter assumptions held sacred by Japanese naval strategists since before the First World War. The Americans had achieved what Japan's most experienced admirals considered physically impossible. They had transformed the aircraft carrier, a weapon of daylight operations, into an. The revolution in naval warfare instrument of round-the-clock destruction was complete, and Japan had been caught utterly unprepared. The transformation began in desperation rather than innovation. By late 1943, Japanese night bombing raids had become a constant torment for American naval forces operating across the Pacific. Every evening brought the distinctive drone of enemy aircraft, their engines creating an irregular rhythm that earned them the nickname Washing Machine Charlie among sleepless American sailors. These attacks, while individually modest in scale, accumulated into a significant strategic problem that conventional defenses could not solve. Commander Joseph Clifton, serving aboard the light carrier USS Independence in the Marshall Islands, documented the frustration in his war diary. The enemy appears overhead with mechanical regularity every night between 2200 and 0400 hours. Our anti-aircraft guns fire blind into darkness, achieving nothing but wasted ammunition and exhausted gun crews. The psychological effect on our men approaches the physical damage inflicted. Something must be done to counter these nocturnal visitors. Traditional naval wisdom declared night carrier operations suicidal. Landing aircraft on a moving deck in broad daylight challenged even experienced pilots. Attempting such maneuvers in complete darkness seemed beyond human capability. The margin for error was measured in feet, the consequences of miscalculation invariably fatal. Every aviation expert, American and Japanese alike, understood these limitations as immutable facts of naval warfare. Yet necessity breeds innovation with remarkable speed during wartime. Captain Turner Caldwell, commanding USS Independence, received orders in August 1943 that would have seemed absurd just months earlier. His ship would undergo conversion to become the world's first dedicated night carrier. The modifications required would challenge every assumption about carrier operations while creating capabilities that enemy intelligence could barely comprehend. The engineering challenges appeared insurmountable. Traditional carrier landing systems depended entirely on visual reference points that vanished in darkness. Pilots approached their ships guided by wake patterns, deck lighting, and signal officers whose flag movements became invisible after sunset. Radio beacons provided rough directional guidance, but landing required split-second visual judgments that seemed impossible without illumination. American engineers solved these problems through technological innovation rather than pilot training. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology had been developing radar systems compact enough for single-seat fighters. These devices, weighing less than 200 pounds, could detect targets at ranges approaching 20 miles, while providing navigation assistance that surpassed human night vision. The Sperry A-1 radar represented a quantum leap beyond anything previously installed in carrier aircraft. The radar equipment itself was revolutionary. Unlike the bulky sets used in land-based night fighters, carrier variants had been miniaturized without sacrificing performance. The system included a cathode ray tube display that showed approaching targets as bright blips against a dark screen. Pilots could track multiple contacts simultaneously while maintaining situational awareness impossible through visual observation alone. Training programs developed for night carrier operations pushed aviation instruction into uncharted territory. Pilots spent months learning to interpret radar displays while flying in complete darkness. They practiced carrier landings using instrument guidance systems that replaced visual cues with electronic signals. The psychological adjustment proved as challenging as the technical skills, requiring aviators to trust instruments over instincts developed through years of daylight flying. The conversion of USS Independence into a night carrier required modifications that transformed the vessel into something unprecedented in naval warfare. Additional catapults were installed to handle increased launch requirements. Landing signal officers received specialized training in directing aircraft approaches using radio communication rather than visual signals. The entire ship's lighting system was redesigned to preserve night vision while providing essential operational illumination. Even more radical were the changes to aircraft themselves. Standard Grumman F-6F. Hellcats received radar installations that altered their weight distribution and cockpit layout. Pilots had to master operating radar controls while simultaneously flying complex approaches in darkness. The learning curve was steep, the margin for error non-existent, yet American aviators proved capable of achievements that Japanese observers would later describe as supernatural. Night Air Group 41 became the laboratory for tactics that would revolutionize carrier warfare. The squadron included both fighter and torpedo bomber elements, creating an integrated night strike capability that could operate independently of daylight hours. Pilots learned to coordinate attacks using radar guidance while maintaining formation discipline in complete darkness. These skills, developed through intensive training, produced capabilities that enemy forces could neither predict nor counter. The first operational deployment of night carrier forces occurred in September 1944 during strikes against Japanese-held Philippines. USS Independence launched aircraft at midnight for attacks against Clark Field and other strategic targets. The missions achieved complete tactical surprise, catching Japanese defenders unprepared for carrier-based attacks and during hours they considered absolutely safe from enemy aviation. Japanese radar operators initially dismissed the approaching contacts as impossible. Carrier aircraft simply did not operate at night. The concept violated fundamental principles of naval aviation that had governed Pacific warfare since 1941. When bombs began falling on supposedly secure installations, confusion spread through Japanese command networks faster than accurate damage reports. Admiral Sumu Toyoda, commanding the combined fleet from Tokyo, received initial reports of night carrier strikes with open skepticism. His staff dismissed early accounts as confused observations of land-based aircraft or submarine-launched floatplanes. The systematic nature of these attacks, their coordination and timing, suggested capabilities that Japanese intelligence assessments declared impossible for American forces to possess. The technological gap between Japanese and American night capabilities widened with each passing month. While Japan struggled to maintain basic flight training programs due to fuel shortages, American industry was mass-producing sophisticated radar systems and electronic navigation aids. Japanese pilots, already facing shortened training periods and inadequate equipment, found themselves confronting enemies equipped with technologies that seemed decades ahead of their own capabilities. The psychological impact on Japanese forces proved as devastating as the physical damage inflicted. Installations previously considered secure during night hours now faced constant threat of attack. Personnel who had relied on darkness for protection discovered that American forces could strike anywhere, anytime, with precision that defied traditional understanding of night operations. The sanctuary of darkness had been eliminated, leaving Japanese forces exposed around the clock to enemy action. As 1944 progressed, American night carrier operations expanded in scope and sophistication. Multiple carriers began coordinating night strikes across vast areas of the Pacific theater. Japanese forces found themselves under sustained attack during hours when their own aircraft remained grounded. The revolution in naval warfare was complete, fundamentally altering the strategic balance in ways that Japanese admirals were only beginning to comprehend. The scope of American night operations reached levels that staggered Japanese naval intelligence. By October 1944, Task Force 38 was conducting round-the-clock strikes against targets across the Philippine archipelago. What had begun as experimental night missions evolved into systematic campaigns that maintained pressure on Japanese forces without respite. The Americans were operating their carriers as floating air bases that never slept, launching strikes at intervals that Japanese defenders could neither predict nor prepare for adequately. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding Japanese surface forces in the Philippines, encountered this new reality during preparations for what would become the Battle of Leyte Gulf. His intelligence officers reported American carrier aircraft attacking installations near Manila at 0300 hours, followed by additional strikes at dawn, then more attacks throughout the afternoon and evening. The pattern suggested multiple carrier groups operating in coordination, but the night attacks indicated capabilities that Japanese doctrine insisted were impossible. The radar-equipped American night fighters proved particularly devastating to Japanese aircraft attempting their traditional nocturnal missions. Lieutenant Commander John Phillips, flying an F-6F Hellcat equipped with the latest Sperry radar system, intercepted and destroyed 3 Japanese bombers in a single night mission over Luzon. His after-action report described encounters that would have been impossible just months earlier. The enemy aircraft appeared on my radar scope at 15 miles range, flying in loose formation at 8,000 feet. I closed to visual contact at approximately 1 mile, identified them as Betty bombers, and engaged immediately. All 3 were destroyed within 12 minutes. Japanese bomber crews, accustomed to operating with impunity during darkness, found themselves hunted by invisible predators. The psychological effect was immediate and profound. Pilots who had previously relied on night cover for protection now faced enemies who seemed to possess supernatural awareness of their positions and movements. The traditional Japanese advantage in night operations evaporated as American technology proved superior to human adaptation to darkness. Admiral Ozawa, despite his growing understanding of American capabilities, struggled to comprehend the organizational achievement these operations represented. Coordinating night launches and recoveries from multiple carriers required precision that surpassed anything the Imperial Navy had attempted. The Americans were not merely conducting individual night missions, but maintaining complex multi-ship operations that sustained attack pressure throughout entire nights while positioning for dawn strikes the following morning. The technical challenges of night carrier operations remained formidable even for American forces. Landing aircraft on carrier decks in complete darkness demanded skills that pushed human capability to its limits. Pilots approached their ships guided by radar and radio beacons, but the final moments of carrier landing still required split-second judgments that could mean the difference between successful recovery and catastrophic accident. The casualty rates during training had been sobering, yet American naval aviation had persevered through the learning process to achieve operational capability. Commander William Martin, credited with developing many of the tactical procedures for night carrier operations, later described the evolution of these capabilities in terms that revealed both the challenges overcome and the advantages gained. We discovered that darkness, rather than being an obstacle to carrier operations, could become our greatest tactical asset. Enemy forces accustomed to respite during night hours found themselves under constant pressure from attacks they could neither see coming nor effectively counter. The psychological impact often exceeded the physical damage inflicted. The logistics of maintaining night operations strained American carrier capabilities to their maximum extent. Fuel consumption increased dramatically when aircraft operated throughout both day and night hours. Maintenance schedules required complete reorganization to service aircraft returning from night missions while preparing others for dawn launches. Personnel rotation became critical as flight deck crews worked extended shifts to support continuous operations that Japanese forces could not sustain with their limited resources. Japanese attempts to counter American night carrier operations revealed the technological and organizational gaps that had developed between the two navies. Traditional anti-aircraft defenses proved largely ineffective against radar-guided attacks conducted in complete darkness. Japanese night fighters, lacking radar systems, could not intercept American aircraft that appeared and disappeared like ghosts in the night sky. Surface vessels attempting to engage American carriers found themselves attacked by aircraft they could not see until bombs were already falling. Admiral Toyoda's staff prepared detailed analyses of American night operations for circulation throughout the combined fleet. These reports acknowledged capabilities that Japanese naval doctrine had declared impossible while attempting to develop countermeasures for threats that exceeded Japanese technological capacity to address effectively. The conclusions were sobering for officers who had built their careers on assumptions of Japanese superiority in night naval operations. The strategic implications extended far beyond individual battles or campaigns. American forces could now maintain offensive pressure around the clock, eliminating the recovery periods that Japanese forces had relied upon to regroup and resupply. The tempo of operations accelerated to levels that Japanese logistics could not match, creating cascading effects that influenced every aspect of naval warfare in the Pacific theater. By November 1944, Japanese naval aviation had effectively ceded control of Pacific skies during night hours to American forces. The few remaining Japanese aircraft capable of night operations were reserved for kamikaze attacks conducted during twilight hours when visibility conditions offered some prospect of reaching targets. The systematic night bombing campaigns that had characterized Japanese operations in 1942 and 1943 had become impossible to sustain against American forces equipped with radar-guided night fighters and comprehensive defensive systems. The transformation of carrier warfare from a daylight-only capability to a round-the-clock operation represented one of the war's most significant technological and tactical revolutions. Japanese admirals who had witnessed this evolution found themselves commanding forces that had lost a fundamental advantage they had possessed since the conflict began. The night no longer offered sanctuary, and the Americans had achieved mastery of a domain that Japanese doctrine insisted belonged exclusively to the Imperial Navy. The evidence of American technological superiority became undeniable during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, though its full implications would not be understood until months later. Japanese combat air patrols operating under visual flight conditions that had served them effectively since Pearl Harbor encountered American night fighters equipped with detection systems that seemed to violate the laws of physics. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most experienced pilots, reported aircraft that approached from impossible angles in complete darkness, striking with precision that suggested enemy pilots possessed supernatural vision. The radar installations aboard American carriers represented industrial achievements that Japanese engineers could barely comprehend. Each set required thousands of precision-manufactured components, assembled to tolerances measured in fractions of inches. The magnetrons that generated radar signals demanded materials and manufacturing processes that Japan's war-ravaged industrial base could no longer provide consistently. While American factories were producing hundreds of these sophisticated systems monthly, Japanese technicians struggled to maintain the few primitive radar sets their forces possessed. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 38, exploited these technological advantages with tactical innovations that multiplied their effectiveness exponentially. His carriers operated in rotating schedules that maintained constant air coverage over target areas throughout entire nights. While one group conducted strikes, another prepared for dawn missions, creating an operational tempo that Japanese forces found impossible to counter or predict. The Americans had transformed carrier warfare from episodic engagements into sustained campaigns that never paused for traditional recovery periods. The training infrastructure required to produce night-qualified carrier pilots revealed another dimension of American advantages that Japanese observers failed to fully appreciate. Specialized facilities across the United States were graduating hundreds of pilots monthly who possessed skills that Japanese training programs could not duplicate. These aviators arrived in the Pacific theater already proficient in instrument flying, radar operation, and night formation techniques that took months to master under combat conditions. Japanese naval aviation, meanwhile, faced cascading shortages that rendered night operations increasingly impossible. Fuel allocations barely permitted basic flight training, much less the extensive night flying required to develop competency in darkness operations. Experienced instructors who might have taught these skills were either dead or deployed to operational units where they faced American forces equipped with overwhelming technological superiority. The pilot training pipeline that had produced Japan's early war advantages had collapsed under pressures that American industry seemed to absorb effortlessly. Admiral Koshiro Oikawa, serving as Navy Minister in Tokyo, received reports throughout late 1944 that painted an increasingly desperate picture of Japanese capabilities versus American achievements. His staff documented American night operations with growing alarm, noting the systematic nature of attacks that suggested organizational capabilities far beyond anything Japan could mount. The Americans were not conducting isolated night missions, but maintaining complex multi-carrier operations that coordinated strikes across hundreds of miles of ocean while sustaining defensive patrols that eliminated Japanese reconnaissance flights. The electronic warfare dimension of night operations proved particularly devastating to Japanese forces. American radar systems not only guided attacking aircraft, but provided early warning of Japanese movements that traditional visual observation could never detect. Japanese surface vessels attempting to approach American task forces found themselves tracked and targeted by aircraft they could not see until explosions revealed their presence. The invisibility that had been Japan's greatest tactical advantage now belonged exclusively to enemy forces. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and survived to observe the transformation of Pacific warfare, later wrote of his astonishment at American night operations witnessed during 1944. The enemy possessed capabilities that seemed to emerge from science fiction rather than naval reality. Their aircraft appeared and disappeared in darkness, with precision that suggested they could see through night itself. We discovered that Americans had not merely improved upon existing technologies, but had created entirely new forms of warfare that our doctrine could not address. The industrial statistics supporting American night operations revealed production capacities that dwarfed Japanese achievements even during peacetime. Each carrier-based radar set required more rare metals and precision electronics than entire Japanese squadrons possessed. American factories were producing these sophisticated systems faster than Japanese forces could destroy them, creating a technological gap that widened with each passing month rather than narrowing through combat attrition. Japanese intelligence estimates of American night fighter strength consistently underestimated the actual numbers by factors of 3 or 4. Reports from scattered combat units described encounters with radar-equipped aircraft that suggested American forces possessed hundreds of night-capable fighters, yet traditional intelligence-gathering methods could not confirm these numbers through visual observation. The Americans had achieved a level of operational security in their night operations that rendered Japanese reconnaissance efforts largely ineffective. The psychological warfare aspects of sustained night operations proved as destructive as their physical impact on Japanese installations and shipping. Personnel who had previously relied on darkness for rest and resupply found themselves under constant threat of attack from enemies they could neither see nor engage effectively. The stress of continuous alert status degraded performance and morale throughout Japanese-held territories, creating cascading effects that influenced every aspect of military operations. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding land-based air forces in the Marianas, experienced these effects firsthand during American operations against Saipan and Guam. His airfields faced systematic night attacks that destroyed aircraft and facilities with precision that seemed to indicate perfect intelligence about Japanese dispositions. The attacks came at intervals that prevented effective repair efforts while maintaining pressure that made normal operations impossible. His forces found themselves fighting an enemy that controlled time itself, striking when and where they chose while remaining invisible to retaliation. The maintenance requirements for sustained night operations tested American logistics systems in ways that Japanese planners assumed would prove impossible to sustain. Carrier aircraft operating throughout both day and night hours required service schedules that doubled normal maintenance workloads. Yet American task forces maintained these demanding schedules for weeks at a time, suggesting organizational capabilities and resource depths that Japanese estimates had failed to account for accurately. Flight deck operations aboard American carriers during night hours required coordination that pushed human capabilities to their limits. Aircraft handlers worked in nearly complete darkness, guided by carefully positioned minimal lighting that preserved night vision while providing essential navigation references. The precision required to launch and recover aircraft safely under these conditions exceeded anything Japanese carriers had attempted. Yet American forces sustained these operations routinely throughout extended campaigns. The navigation challenges of night carrier operations demanded technological solutions that Japan's electronics industry could not provide. American aircraft used radio beacons, radar guidance, and electronic navigation aids that enabled precise positioning in complete darkness. Japanese pilots, dependent on visual reference points that vanished after sunset, found themselves increasingly unable to locate targets or return to bases when American night fighters eliminated the illuminated reference points they required for navigation. The strategic implications of American night carrier mastery extended beyond tactical victories to fundamental changes in the balance of naval power. Japanese forces could no longer plan operations around the assumption that darkness provided sanctuary from carrier-based attacks. The Americans had eliminated the temporal limitations that had governed carrier warfare since its inception, creating capabilities that rendered traditional Japanese defensive strategies obsolete. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's pre-war predictions about American industrial potential proved prophetic in ways he had not anticipated. The United States had not merely outproduced Japanese industry in terms of quantity, but had achieved qualitative advances that represented generational leaps beyond Japanese capabilities. Night carrier operations embodied this technological revolution, demonstrating American mastery of electronics, precision manufacturing, and organizational coordination that Japanese forces could neither match nor effectively counter through traditional naval tactics. The revolution in carrier warfare that began with desperate improvisation had evolved into systematic capabilities that fundamentally altered the nature of naval combat. American forces possessed the ability to maintain offensive pressure throughout entire days and nights, eliminating the recovery periods that Japanese doctrine assumed were essential for sustained operations. The night sky, once Japan's domain, now belonged to an enemy whose technological advantages seemed to grow stronger with each passing month. The transformation of night carrier operations from experimental curiosity to devastating strategic weapon accelerated throughout the final months of 1944. By December, American task forces were conducting coordinated night strikes across multiple theaters simultaneously. Task Force 38 maintained continuous pressure against Japanese installations in the Philippines, while Task Force 58 prepared for operations against the Japanese home islands themselves. The scope of these operations defied every assumption Japanese naval planners had held about the limitations of carrier-based aviation. Lieutenant Commander Robert Winston, flying night missions from USS Intrepid, documented the evolution of American capabilities in his personal journal. 6 months ago, we considered night carrier operations suicidal experiments. Tonight, I led 12 aircraft against targets near Manila with precision that would have been impossible in daylight using conventional navigation methods. Our radar systems guide us to targets we cannot see, through weather that would have grounded entire air groups just a year ago. The enemy has no defense against weapons they cannot comprehend. The technical sophistication of American night operations reached levels that Japanese engineers studying captured equipment found difficult to believe. Radar sets recovered from downed American aircraft contained components that required manufacturing processes Japan had never mastered. The magnetron tubes alone demanded precision machining and exotic materials that Japanese industry could no longer obtain through normal supply channels. Each American night fighter carried electronics worth more than entire Japanese squadrons possessed in total equipment value. Japanese attempts to develop countermeasures for American night operations revealed the growing technological chasm between the two navies. The few radar sets Japan had managed to produce operated on frequencies that American electronic warfare specialists could jam effortlessly. Japanese night fighters, when they managed to locate American aircraft, discovered that enemy pilots possessed situational awareness that seemed supernatural. American aviators could detect and engage Japanese aircraft at ranges where visual identification remained impossible, then disappear into darkness before retaliation became feasible. Admiral Sumu Toyota, commanding the combined fleet, convened emergency conferences throughout December 1944 to address the crisis of American night operations. His staff presented analyses that painted an increasingly desperate picture of Japanese defensive capabilities. Traditional anti-aircraft guns proved largely ineffective against attacks conducted in complete darkness. Surface vessels attempting to engage American carriers found themselves targeted by aircraft that appeared without warning, struck with devastating precision, then vanished before effective response became possible. The organizational achievement represented by sustained night carrier operations impressed even American observers who witnessed these capabilities daily. Vice Admiral John McCain, commanding Task Group 38.1, described the complexity in his operational reports. Coordinating multi-carrier night strikes requires precision that exceeds anything previously attempted in naval warfare. We launch aircraft in complete darkness, navigate them hundreds of miles to targets they cannot see, coordinate attacks with timing measured in minutes, then recover them aboard moving ships using electronic guidance systems. The margin for error approaches zero, yet our aircrew execute these missions with reliability that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. The fuel consumption requirements for round-the-clock carrier operations strained even American logistics capabilities. Aircraft operating throughout both day and night hours consumed aviation gasoline at rates that exceeded normal planning estimates by factors of 2 or 3. Yet American tankers maintained supply schedules that kept task forces operational for months at a time, demonstrating industrial capacity that Japanese planners had failed to anticipate accurately, even in their most pessimistic assessments of American potential. Japanese submarine commanders attempting to attack American carrier task forces discovered that night operations provided no advantage against enemies equipped with comprehensive radar coverage. Traditional approaches that relied on darkness for concealment proved useless against detection systems that revealed submarine positions regardless of visibility conditions. The few successful attacks achieved by Japanese submarines during late 1944 occurred during daylight hours when visual observation supplemented electronic detection, exactly the reverse of patterns that had characterized submarine warfare since 1941. The maintenance challenges of sustaining night operations pushed American technical capabilities to their limits, while revealing organizational depths that Japanese forces could not match. Carrier aircraft returning from night missions required service procedures that differed significantly from daylight operations. Engines stressed by extended operations at combat power needed inspection intervals that compressed normal maintenance schedules. Yet American task forces maintained operational readiness rates that Japanese intelligence considered impossible given the intensity of operations being conducted. Flight deck crews aboard American carriers developed procedures for night operations that required coordination approaching choreographed precision. Aircraft handlers worked in nearly complete darkness, guided by minimal lighting systems that provided essential references while preserving night vision adaptation. The complexity of launching and recovering aircraft safely under these conditions exceeded anything Japanese carriers had attempted. Yet American forces sustained these demanding operations throughout extended campaigns without significant degradation in safety or efficiency. Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most experienced aviation tacticians, observed American night operations during the Battle of the Philippine Sea with growing alarm. His post-battle analysis, circulated among combined fleet staff, acknowledged capabilities that Japanese doctrine had declared impossible. The enemy possesses technological advantages that render traditional tactical responses inadequate. Their aircraft operate with precision in complete darkness that suggests electronic guidance systems beyond our current understanding. We face opponents who have eliminated the fundamental limitations that have governed aerial warfare since its inception. The electronic warfare dimension of American night operations proved particularly devastating to Japanese communications and navigation systems. American aircraft equipped with jamming devices could disrupt Japanese radar installations while remaining invisible to retaliation. Japanese pilots attempting to navigate using radio beacons found their signals overwhelmed by interference that made position finding impossible. The electromagnetic spectrum itself had become an American weapon that Japanese forces could neither effectively use nor adequately defend against. Japanese industrial capacity, already strained by years of warfare and resource shortages, proved incapable of producing the sophisticated electronics required for effective night operations. The few radar systems Japan managed to manufacture operated with reliability problems that made them dangerous to operate under combat conditions. Vacuum tubes failed regularly due to quality control issues in manufacturing. Power supplies produced inconsistent output that rendered electronic systems unreliable when precision was most critical. The training infrastructure required to produce night-qualified pilots represented another dimension of American advantages that Japanese planners had failed to anticipate. Specialized facilities across the United States were graduating aviators monthly who possessed skills that Japanese training programs could not duplicate under wartime conditions. These pilots arrived in combat theaters already proficient in instrument flying, radar operation, and night formation techniques that would have required months of combat experience to develop through operational learning. Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding surface forces during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, encountered American night capabilities that fundamentally altered his tactical planning. Intelligence reports described carrier aircraft attacking his formations at intervals throughout the night, maintaining pressure that prevented effective maneuvering or concentration of forces. The Americans had achieved tactical flexibility that rendered traditional Japanese surface tactics obsolete, forcing defensive postures that negated the advantages Japanese forces had possessed in earlier engagements. The psychological impact of sustained night operations extended beyond combat units to affect Japanese civilian morale in occupied territories. Populations that had previously felt secure during nighttime hours found themselves under threat from attacks that could occur at any moment without warning. The constant stress of potential air raids degraded productivity in war industries, while creating refugee populations that strained already limited resources in Japanese-held areas. Japanese naval aviation, already weakened by pilot losses and fuel shortages, found itself unable to contest American control of nighttime skies. The few remaining experienced aviators were reserved for daylight operations, where visual flying skills provided some advantage against technologically superior opponents. Night missions became suicide operations that achieved minimal results, while consuming irreplaceable human resources that Japanese forces could no longer afford to waste. The strategic implications of American night carrier mastery became apparent during planning for operations against the Japanese home islands. American forces could maintain offensive pressure around the clock, eliminating recovery periods that Japanese defenders required for regrouping and resupply. The tempo of operations that American forces could sustain exceeded Japanese capacity to respond effectively, creating cascading effects that influenced every aspect of defensive planning. The Japanese admirals who witnessed American night carrier operations in 1944 discovered a truth that shattered their understanding of naval warfare. The nation that had dominated Pacific night operations since Pearl Harbor found itself outmatched by an enemy whose technological capabilities exceeded their wildest imagination. The Americans had transformed darkness from sanctuary into weapon, creating round-the-clock offensive power that rendered Japanese defensive strategies obsolete. What began as desperate improvisation evolved into systematic dominance that eliminated the temporal limitations governing carrier warfare since its inception. The revolution was complete, and Japan's admirals could only watch as their empire fell to enemies who controlled both day and night.